which is your Innatism
which is
the conception of Innatism is Innatism?
Innatism, yeah.
And also the connection of this with the Rationalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't see innatism as an issue. I mean, everybody accepts some form of innatism. I mean, everyone agrees that humans aren't birds, let's say, when they're not rocks. And as soon as you agree with that, then you've accepted innatism, unless you believe in angels or something. We have some special innate structure that makes us humans. That's not even in doubt. There is, you could conceivably argue that we don't have any innate structure for language, but that's almost unimaginable. I mean, it's impossible to, with the most extensive effort, to teach even the tiniest rudiments of language to even higher apes, their closest relatives. And humans learn it without any evidence at all, virtually, just minimal stimulation. So it must follow that they have an extremely rich structure for language. Now again, somebody might believe, and it's been argued, that it's just our general intelligence applied to this material. But in order to make that a serious proposal, you'd have to say, okay, what are the mechanisms of general intelligence? And how are they different from those of, say, apes? And nobody can even begin to answer that question. So to question that we have a specific capacity for language, which in fact is highly restricted, to question to that is just mysticism at this point. Now, if people want to question it, okay, but it's like saying I don't believe that the law of gravity works. Or if somebody said that I don't believe that innate structure makes some cells become chickens and other ones become humans, you can't argue with them exactly. It's just, these are things that are obvious. The only interesting question is, what's the innate structure? Well, there are substantive issues, and lots of work and so on. My own feeling is it's so restricted that virtually all of language is innate. And about the only differences between languages are in parts of the lexicon, choice of words, some grammatical elements and so on, very peripheral things. That can't really be established yet, but I think there's reasonable evidence for it. As to the connection with rationalism, there's a serious question of interpretation. I mean, there is a tradition going from Plato into, say, Cartesian rationalism. And there are continuities, but there are also differences. One of the continuities has to do with innatism. Plato was concerned with very much the same problem. How can it be that we know so much when we have so little evidence? And for example, in the Meno, the Socratic dialogue is essentially a way of teasing out from the slave boy his innate knowledge of geometry. That's kind of like a thought experiment, trying to demonstrate that the slave boy who had never heard of geometry actually knew it all. And, the experiment is more or less accurate. I mean, that's what would happen under those conditions. Plato then wanted an answer, and his answer was that it's in our souls, and we remember it from an earlier existence. Well, okay, that's not entirely false. It's in our genes, actually, and it comes from previous existence, in a sense. That answer and this problem then goes right into the 17th century. And, for example, Leibniz argues that Plato's theory must be correct. There's no other way to account for knowledge. But as he put it, his theory has to be purged of the error of reminiscence. So somehow that was wrong, but he didn't have anything else to make right. Cartesian rationalism is pretty much the same. I mean, it's basically the Cartesian rationalists tried to, for example, the ones who worked on language, say the people in the universal grammar tradition that in part grew out of this, their concept of universal grammar is basically that which is in our souls, that which is there and doesn't change and so on. And they developed, not by our standards, but by the standards of the time, fairly rich theories of universal grammar. Well, this tradition then continues through German Romanticism and through the Enlightenment, and it takes various forms, and then it sort of dies out in the middle of the 19th century. And really wasn't picked up again until the middle of the 20th century, with some scattered exceptions. Well, that's rationalism. What about Under that interpretation of rationalism, this is a renewal of rationalism. However, there are other interpretations of rationalism, and you can decide what you want to look for in this tradition. It had a lot of things in it. One of the things that was in it was an attempt to deduce all the facts of the world from first principles. I mean, Cartesian rationalism is, well, you start with the cogito, and then you keep going, and you end up with all the facts about the world. Well, obviously, this isn't rationalism in that sense. So it's a question, which, out of this rich, complex tradition, which strands do you pick out? Some strands that you can pick out carry from Plato right through classical rationalism into the Enlightenment, and then on to the modern period. Other ones have been abandoned, which were quite central to them. If you look in contrast at the alternative major, say the empiricist tradition, at least the classical empiricist tradition, say Hume, also was innatist. I mean, they didn't question that there was an awful lot of innate structure. Just they thought it was a different innate structure. So Hume actually specified what he thought it was. It was principles of association and similarity and an innate concept of induction. I mean, remember, after all, Hume is, everybody knows, he's remembered for his paradoxes of induction, but of course he also gave an answer. His answer was that it's just animal instinct, which is what we would call innate. So in Humean psychology, which becomes modern psychology in many ways, the principles of association by similarity and contiguity and so on, and the principle of simple induction are the innate structure. Well, that's just hopelessly inadequate. In fact, if you look at the contrast between Descartes and Hume, who were maybe the two leading figures in these two, a century apart, but two leading figures in this tradition, actually looked at some of the same examples and drew opposite conclusions, and crucial examples. So, for example, Descartes asks the question, rather like Plato. He says, suppose you presented I forget the figure, some geometrical figure, say a triangle, to a child in infancy, before the infant had had any experience. He says the child would perceive it as a triangle, which of course it isn't physically. It's always going to have a curve and a line, and always some distortion of a triangle. But the child will perceive it as a distorted triangle, not as an exact image of what it is. I mean, it's some strange, indescribable figure. If I draw something on the blackboard, it'll never be a triangle. But he says the child will perceive it as a triangle, not which it isn't. It just resembles one. And he will not perceive it as what it is, because that's too complex. Hume looked at the same example and concluded that he mentioned, for him it was a straight line, but it's the same question. And he simply concluded, reasonably from his point of view, that people have no concept of a straight line. And the reason is because you can't tell the difference between a line with a slight curve in it and a straight line, so therefore by his principles, it follows that you can't have a concept of a straight line. There's a direct difference in predictions. For Descartes, you have a concept of geometrical figures, because that's the way your brain is, your mind for him is designed. Therefore, a person will see things in the world as modifications of geometrical figures. Hume, on the other hand, given his principles of innate structure, has to conclude, and is honest enough to conclude, that you just don't have a concept of a straight line. Well, we know who was right about that. In fact, even without the experiments, it was obvious at the time that Humean psychology was refuted by this fact, whereas Cartesian psychology was, if not proven, at least vindicated by it. Unfortunately, history took the other turn. It was assumed that Hume was right and Descartes was wrong, although it's obviously the opposite. And it really wasn't until the modern period that that it's become obvious to any perceptual psychologist, at least, that, of course, Descartes is right. I mean, not that anybody thinks about Descartes anymore, but the conclusion that is standard today is that, yes, obviously, the brain, no longer the mind, the brain is designed so as to identify certain kinds of figures and not others, and in fact, they're simple ones like lines and angles and so on. And that's how we construct our picture of the world, basically the Cartesian conception without Cartesian physiology and metaphysics. And nobody would take seriously Hume's proposal that we don't have a concept of a straight line. Of course we have a concept of a straight line, everybody does. Well, through this strain of the history, the modern work is rationalist. But as I say, there are other ways of looking at the history. You can think other things in it are important. I mean, you can think the proof of the existence of God is important. Okay? In that case, this obviously isn't rationalist.